So last week, to celebrate Konami deciding to drop the Early Days Collection on us, I reviewed what were in my opinion the top 10 worst promos put into a Yu-Gi-Oh video game box. Also, side note, I'd like to make a quick correction from the last video. Yeah, it turns out I misread Dark Sage, and it actually can be summoned from the deck as well as the hand once Time Wizard resolves. Whether that makes it better or worse than the Great Moth, I'll let you guys decide. Anyway, that's the correction, back to the video. Anyway, while I do enjoy talking smack about bad cards, I'm actually much more excited today because I get to talk about the best cards to come from those Game Boy Advance and PSP game boxes. Honestly, I enjoy being positive far more on this channel. I'm going to talk about some of the first really good cards I ever had. It's something I'm really looking forward to doing, along with showing some other cards Konami for some reason gave all his kids for free by being really powerful and in some cases format warping. Also, so in celebration of the Early Days Collection, today I'm going to take my own trip back to my early days and talk about the 10 best promos from Yu-Gi-Oh video games, looking at how good these cards could be and how insane it was that Konami gave some of these cards out as promos for free. Let's begin. Now, most of the cards on this list come from the Yu-Gi-Oh Game Boy and Game Boy Advance games. However, we're actually going to kick things off with the GX Tag Force games for the PSP, and Konami, if somehow you see this, please make a Early Days Collection too with those games. Now I'll be honest, as amazing as these games were, the promo quality had dropped a lot since the Game Boy Advance era, as I guess Konami realised these cards were too good to give away for free in games. However, there were still a few bright spots with the Tag Force promos, with one of the biggest being Dark Bribe. A counter trap, Dark Bribe, in addition to, let's call it questionable art, is essentially a great example of reasonable power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! You see, here's the trap Magic Gemmer, a counter trap that negates a spell activation for the cost of a discard. Not a bad effect, but the -1 and relatively narrow targets made it fall under the radar in the face of solemn judgment and a plentiful amount of back row hate at the time. Dark Bribe, on the other hand, can not only negate both spells and trap cards, but instead of costing you a resource, it grants the opponent one by letting them draw a card. Now yes, this isn't ideal either, as making an opponent go neutral in card advantage rather than -1, and giving them a new card, but the fact that this card can hit all back row and not cost you a resource means it has seen a little bit of play over the years in Edison format in particular, and others around this era as well, particularly in stun decks and other Protect the Castle style strategies, along with decks that want more heavy back row like gadgets. Now, admittedly, this card didn't see play anywhere near as much as the rest of this list due to, giving opponents free draws being bad, but it still did more than most other game promos, so it gets number 10 spot on this list. Many players complain about the price of Yu-Gi-Oh nowadays, justifiably so by the way, but as someone who's played this game since the beginning, I can tell you price has always been a problem with this game. Yes, inflation and other factors have obviously played a role in the ballooning of card prices, but even back in the early years, many of Yu-Gi-Oh's top tier cards demanded outrageous prices, with two of the most expensive staples being Ring of Destruction and of course Mirror Force. And removal as a whole was on the more expensive side, with Heavy Storm, MST, Zaborg and many other cards demanding high prices for getting reprinted into hell. Wow, things really haven't changed that much over the years in Yu-Gi-Oh, have they? However, before the staple reprint bonanza that was the early structure decks, young and budget players really had a few major options when it came to monster removal, including Fissure, Smashing Ground, Rageki Break, and the most prominent, Sakuretsu Armor. A normal trap that destroys any attacking monster, and a powerful removal effect printed at common, this card was a staple in many budget decks, and thanks to this promo they got another easy to access removal trap in Widespread Ruin. A normal trap card, Ruin, also destroys a monster upon attacking. However, unlike Armor, this trap sadly didn't let you choose the monster it destroys, as no matter which attacking monster you flip this on, it will always destroy the attack position monster with the highest attack points. Which, yes, to make it less effective than Ring or Armor, but still gets the job done, and let's be honest here, back then you'd often use one of your removal cards on the biggest threat anyway, so often this card is basically just 3 more copies of Sakuretsu Armor, and beggars can't be choosers, I guess. However, it wasn't just budget players making use of this card either. In fact, many aggressive decks in Go format have made use of this card over the years, because when your whole deck revolves around attacking as much as possible and winning as quickly as possible, Use as much removal as possible to get big boys out of your way, take the opponent in the face as often as you can. Overall, this may not be the most complex or interesting piece of removal out there, but does the job well enough, and for many budget and go to aggro players, that sometimes can be just all you need. Up next, we're looking at one of the promos from Stairway to the Destined Duel, and spoiler alert, it won't be the last one on this list, because this being one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh! Game Boy Advance games of all time, it also has one of the best promo bundles ever made, with 2 vs 3 cards being meta-warping staples. The third was Valkyria, and let's not talk about that, shall we? And we're kicking things off with Sinister Serpent, or as I call it, Karma for playing Delinquent Duo. Gotta get the duo hate in there somewhere, I guess. A useless 300 attack point monster on the field, Serpent is instead a card we want to keep in our hand, but if we're sent to the graveyard it can come back to our hand during the next standby phase. And yes, I know if you've got a more modern version of this card it says something completely different. Trust me, we'll get to that. Now at first you may think, why would I care if a monster with this low attack point comes back to my hand every turn? And by you, I mean 10-year-old me. But the value of this little card can generate can't be overstated, especially in GOAT and pre-GOAT formats. Firstly, as implied, this card is one of the best counters to both drop off, a card that makes you discard a card we've drawn for turn, and more importantly, Delinquent Duo, aka the most evil card in GOAT. The only not banned spell ruler hand attack card in GOAT format, Duo discards a card random from your hand, and then forces you to send another card from your hand to the graveyard. As you can imagine, this effect can be back-breaking early on in a game of GOAT, so having a card like this that turns Duo into a worse version of Confiscation is pretty powerful. If you also play Generating Mummy, by the way, you can further insulate yourself from Duo, as that card comes back to your hand, making it possible with both those cards to completely blank a Duo. Happened to me once in a game of GOAT, by the way, and it was one of the funniest rage quits I've ever seen. However, even outside of countering one of GOAT's most powerful cards, Serpent has many uses in older Yu-Gi-Oh! Firstly, this card is really good at being a tribute fodder for monarchs and other tribute monsters, so when it comes back to your hand each turn it's like getting the monster for free. However, more importantly is how it works with some of GOAT's best removal cards. Outside of Ring of Destruction, the 2 best pieces of non-battle trap removal were a Geki Break and Phoenix Wing Wind Blast, with the former popping a card on the field and the latter spinning a card back to the top of the owner's deck. However, as good as these cards were, they both had a pretty decent downside of discarding a card for cost. Whilst a great way of balancing at the time very powerful removal, would be a shame if that cost became non-existent. And finally, in a dire situation, this card can serve as an okay defender, as every time it's destroyed it'll come right back to your hand, meaning you always have at least one monster to set and protect your life points when you're losing, to give you time to rebuild your hand. Not ideal, but it could be useful in a pinch. So yeah, Sinister Serpent was pretty good for its time, but I gotta emphasise the word was there, because after this card got banned and staying there for over a decade, for reasons I will never understand, it was eventually released with an awful errata that banished it, that said it was brought back if it was sent to the graveyard again. Yeah, sure, this card was absolutely going to be a problem in post-Duelist Alliance Yu-Gi-Oh! It absolutely needed that kind of brutal downside. I still believe that CD was the worst errata in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, but this may be the most pointless, so this card was already useless by the point it was unbanned, and all this errata is done to make players more cautious when buying copies for their GOAT decks. So overall, while the errata version is awful, the original Sinister Serpent is one of the best monsters you never want to summon in old Yu-Gi-Oh! That helped push the power of control decks to give them a fair shot at competing with Chaos Turbo and aggro decks. So for that legacy, it gets this spot on the list. It's hard being the overshadowed sibling, isn't it? A monster with DD in its name that bashes a monster it battles with, you'll be forgiven for thinking I'm talking about DD Warrior Lady, which is both one of the most iconic Yu cards never to appear in the anime, and an absolute staple of the first half-decade of Yu-Gi-Oh! This is because, in addition to being one of the best light monsters of its era, Warrior Lady can banish any monster it battles, taking out both massive threats and shutting off problematic graveyard abilities at the same time. And at first glance you would think that DD Assailant is for most part just a bigger version of this, as it has 700 attack points and can banish a monster it battles when it's destroyed. However, Assailant is a lot worse than Lady for 3 main reasons. 1, it's not a Sangard or Shining Angel target, meaning that the only way to get this card out of your deck was Rota. 2, it's an earth, not a light, meaning unlike Lady, this card Engrave can't be used to fuel chaos monsters of your own, and most notably, unlike Lady, this card only banishes monsters when she's destroyed in battle, meaning while she can take out cards like BLS, Chaos Soak or Monarchs, she can't remove most light and dark monsters before they hit the graveyard, meaning unlike Lady, she can't disrupt a chaos player and prevent them from setting up their chaos monsters in the first place. None of this, however, makes this card bad, as not only can this card still remove any big monster it battles with from the game, it also is a decent body that can beat over a decent amount of monsters, and more importantly, it's an earth, making it better than Warrior Lady in one of Gulfamod's best anti-chaos decks, Earth Aggro, as not only is it a good beater that can easily out-chaos monsters, but if the card stays in your graveyard, it becomes a great banishing fodder for either another beater in the Rock Spirit, or more likely the 1900 attack point Gigantes, a card that's not only a massive beater at 4 stars, but also a heavy storm on legs when he's destroyed. Overall, yes, Assailant is a lot worse than DD Warrior Lady, due to a weaker version of both the banish effect and her less supported attribute, but that's like saying Matt Hardy is a lesser brother to Jeff Hardy, as they're both so amazing. For our next entry, we're going further back in time to my favourite Yu-Gi-Oh format, Perfect Circle, with Destiny Hero Disc Commander. The absolute peak of Monarchs as an archetype. One of the reasons for this was the hero engine it played that used Malicious as tribute fodder, and this card combined with Destiny Draw to draw a boatload of cards, mostly nullifying the downside of Monarchs, aka the bricking. A level 1 monster, Disc Commander has the effect of being essentially a pot of greed, as when special from the graveyard it can draw you 2 cards. Also, despite what you may see on newer versions of this card, when it was first released it was not a once per duel, meaning yes, you could repeatedly bring this card back with the likes of Call of the Haunted, Premature Burial and Monster Reborn for an insane card draw. Now this card was good in a hero strategy, but what truly broke it was when Monarchs in 2007 started using their Destiny Hero engine with this card, Malicious, Doomlord, and most importantly, Destiny Draw. This meant you could pitch this card with Destiny Draw to draw 2 cards, and then bring it back with Premature Burial Call the Haunted to draw 2 more cards, and have a body on board to tribute for a Monarch, usually Caius or Riser, which when combined with Phoenix Flame Windblast along with Riser, stacked the opponent's deck with 2 useless cards, often meaning insurmountable card advantage. This card also did similar things in more pure hero decks as well, often being used to set up plasma locks, and likely would have made Teledad even more unbeatable had kind of not come to their senses and banned him, which probably for the best. This card would have also been a level 1 in the Synchro era, as well as a card drawing powerhouse. He may be a shadow of his former self now, that like Serpent was ratted long after he was relevant, but I will always love this guy for bringing my, at the time, favourite deck to its greatest heights. So thank you for all the good memories, Commander, and I salute you with this spot on the list. Up next, boys, girls and non-binaries, we're going to learn about future-proofing and why it's important when printing cards for a TCG. You see, in Yu-Gi-Oh's first starter decks we got the card Change of Heart, a card that lets you take control of any monster on the opponent's field for no cost whatsoever, an effect so powerful in early Yu-Gi-Oh that it got the card banned fairly quickly. After which we got a whole bunch of cards that attempted, mostly without success, to make a more powered down version of this card. First, we had Snatch Steal, an equip that took a monster for as long as it was equipped, at the cost of giving the opponent 1,000 points a turn. A card that, despite having more downsides than Change of Heart, was actually in many ways its superior, as while it couldn't take face-down monsters, it did grant you final flexibility with what you could do with what you stole, because you had it for more than 1 turn. So for the next attempt, Konami made Brain Control, a card that prior to its errata was essentially Change of Heart for face-up monsters and a life point cost, and this card was also stable for years in Monarch decks. So finally we've got the card Mind Control, which like Change of Heart, could take any monster regardless of position, whether face-up or face-down. However, unlike the now banned Change of Heart, this card had nothing else but downsides. As well, it could take any monster, that monster could not attack or be tributed. And for those who don't know, this came up when the extra deck was just the Fusion deck. And let's be honest here, mostly just a Metamorphosis board, meaning all this card was really good for, on release, was removing monsters from the opponent's side of the field to make it more easy to hit them directly, or stealing monsters with effects you could use, which most of the time meant flip monsters like Gravekeeper's Spy, or fusions like Thousand Eyes Restrict. So here we've got a balanced version of a previously broken card that has a very limited but effective use. A perfect card as long as we never get new swimming mechanics that this card makes super easy, right? Oh yeah. Yes, this card was good on release, but upon the release of Synchro Monsters, an extra deck type that didn't need a specific card and could move with mind control monsters fairly easily, this card just became another change of heart in essence. Yes, this card is a machine that turns any monster between levels 2 and 6 into Stardust Dragon. As the game gained more and more extra deck types, this card only grew stronger, with it easily able to turn stolen monsters to rank 3 or 4s, or an XT set that was quite popular at the time. And when Link Monsters came out, this card pretty much just became a second change of heart for going second decks. In fact, this card was so good, once Links came out, it now sits alongside Change of Heart and Snatch Steal at 1 copy on the limited list. Now overall, I applaud what the designers of Mind Control attempted to do by making a fixed version of a clearly broken card with reasonable downsides, and I love this card as a way to take out monsters and steal effects in GOAT format. While this card became much stronger than originally intended, it never really became a broken card, even when the fundamentally broken link mechanic became a thing. So overall, a great card that absolutely earns this spot on the list. Yes, that's right. The starter of one of the most powerful decks from the first half of 2010's Yu-Gi-Oh! Began its life as a video game promo. While it's true that Infernity didn't become a real deck until the release of most of their support in booster sets, the archetype began its life as 3 promos from the 2009 World Championship DS game, alongside Infernity Dwarf and Infernity Defender. But don't let those pieces of crap fool you, as unlike those two, Archfiend is not just a powerful card, but actually one of the strongest monsters to come out of a video game, and one of the few cards in Yu-Gi-Oh's history that fundamentally changed how cards were designed. Firstly, like all other Infernity cards, this card requires you to have an empty hand for any of its effects to be live, a condition that turned the otherwise simply bad cards of Dwarf and Guardian into 2 of the worst cards ever printed. In Archfiend's case, however, this downside can be justified by its exceptionally powerful effects, and when I say powerful I mean strong enough for the deck it's a backbone of to not only survive multiple bannings, but also over half a decade of power creep, including the massive jump in power that was Duelist Alliance. Why is that, you ask? Well, firstly, this card can summon itself from your hand if you draw it when your hand is empty. Narata once called this card the patron saint of top decks, and has had to argue that this is one of the best cards to draw in a pinch. Why is that? Because on summon, if you've got no cards in your hand, this card adds any Infernity card to your hand. That's it? I'm sure you're thinking? A basic Stratos effect? Why is that so powerful? Well, that's not what's written on the card itself, but what's not written on the card. Yeah, remember when I said this card changed how cards are designed? We know 95% of cards these days have a soft or hard once per turn clause. Yeah, this asshole's the reason why. Yeah, basically every card in this deck is designed to either search Archfiend, revive him, or be part of the end board he creates, with cards like Infernity Launcher and Necromancer being able to summon him multiple times, with their also not once per turn effects, with the ultimate goal of making a massive board of Synchro monsters and later XC and Link monsters, backed up by multiple copies of Infernity Barrier and Infernity Break, to negate and pop cards respectively. This led to Infernity both dominating multiple formats, like I said, both pre and post Duelist Alliance, as they really were the first Yu-Gi-Oh deck to play at the modern speed, and they pretty much remained playable, even getting stronger upon the release of Links, until the banning of all the good generic negates like Savage Dragon and Appaloosa, and since then with far less good generic monsters to end on, and the ramping up of anti-combo cards and hand traps, Infernity has sadly faded into obscurity. Still, nearly a decade of playability is more than most Yu-Gi-Oh cards get, so take a bow Infernity Archfiend and enjoy this spot on the list. Up next we've got an old staple that is in my opinion the perfect example of how to do power creep the right way, in Dimensional Prison. A normal trap card, Prison has the effect to remove any attacking monster from the game, and if this simple effect sounds both good for the time and very familiar to you, you're not wrong, as this card is essentially a power creep version of good format staple Sakuretsu Armor, a normal trap that can destroy an attacking monster. Seeing play from its release up until ruler format, Prison is a historical card for 2 reasons when it comes to battle traps or trap cards that can be used during attacks. Firstly, it essentially made all of the single target battle traps up to this point redundant, as why reflect damage back to the opponent or destroy a monster, thus putting it in a zone where it could be useful, when instead you could just banish the card, making it almost guaranteed to be used for the rest of the game. Sure, cards like Mirror Force persisted for a while, but this card was essentially the final frontier for a removal that only works during the battle phase. Which brings me on to the second reason that this card is historically important to Yu-Gi-Oh! It more or less marked the end of battle traps in top tier play. Not so that removal traps stopped being a thing in the game, it's just that from this point, we started to realise that the game had evolved to the point where removal that could be used at any time was better than situational phase restricted cards like this. Essentially, this card is the bridge between cards like Magic Cylinder and Sakuratsu Armor being staples, and then cards like Wing Blast and Kamakurt along with modern cards like Dynamishkus and Archfiend's Ghastly Glitch being used more. So thank you for laying the groundwork for modern trap cards, Deep Prison. Now stop bashing my chaos targets! Coming in at number 2, we are once more going back to the obscure Xbox games with Anti-Spell Fragrance. If you listen closer, you can now hear the sound of a Runic and a Sky Striker player screaming in anger. That player being me, because man, I hate this card. I hate it more than every card on the worst list. I hate how it shuts down so many of my decks. I hate the non-games I've won when siding this card in, and I hate that thanks to the Gallant Granite combo in the new Odeon deck, this card is still playable despite being at 1. I hate this, I hate it, I hate it! Okay, rant over, let's get to why I hate this card so much. One of the most powerful floodgates ever made, Anti-Spell Fragrance does what it says on the tin. As for many decks, it essentially locks them out of spell cards, not completely like Imperial Order, but only temporarily in theory, by forcing players to set them for a turn before activation. Now originally this card wasn't too powerful in the slow mid-2000s Yu-Gi-Oh!, where essentially all it did was turn spell cards into worse trap cards. However, as the game got faster and new types of spell cards this card was particularly good against were printed, this card essentially became a new Imperial Order. As preventing a card from being used for one turn, it's essentially preventing it from being used at all, as Yu-Gi-Oh! Is far quicker now than when this card was conceived, and while games can still go longer than 3 turns, that usually doesn't happen when one deck can barely play cards at all. Because of this card has seen play a lot over the years, especially since the game's first major speed up with Duelist Alliance, with being a major pain for decks like Sky Striker, Runic variants, or any deck with spell cards as a major focus. In addition to this, the card was usually backed by the likes of Rivalry of Warlords and Gozen Match, limiting the front row as well, making the game even more difficult for the opponent to play. However, while this card, for all intents and purposes, ended the game versus most spell decks, there's one kind of deck where this card literally makes unplayable, and that of course is pendulum decks. Being the first cards for hybrids of spells and monsters, pendulums could either be summoned as a monster or placed face up as a continuous spell card, and the game plan of most decks with pendulums was a combo based one that used the unique mechanic of pendulum summoning to spam the field with monsters by placing pendulum cards with 2 different scales face up spell cards, and then summoning monsters with levels between those scales from the hand and face up from the extra deck. So yeah, but by playing this one card, it made it so players couldn't use pendulum cards, because pendulum monsters were not spells until placed on the field, and therefore could not be set. Now yes, pendulum decks could still technically play into this card, as they still had access to a couple of non-pendulum summons and their extra deck, but as the deck was designed to summon a ton of monsters, this state almost always led to them being curb stomped by other decks that could play into this card, like Cosmo in 2016, Zoo in 2017, and Spiral in 2018 for examples. Because of this, Fragrance would be a side deck mainstay for years, showing whether a spell-heavy deck was meta, from Sky Striker and Pendulum Edition to Runic decks, with being especially good in trap-heavy decks like Labyrinth, to not only have the lack of spell cards in that deck, but with them playing cards like Lord of Heavenly Prison, they could even search it from time to time. This continued up until 2023, when this spell, alongside many other powerful floodgates, were put to 1, thus making them too consistent to run in most non-trap or stun decks, and thus the card faded from relevance. That is until the Odeon deck came out, which, like I said, was not only a powerful trap-based deck, but could also easily make Gallant Granite as part of its combo, a card that could search you Lord of the Heavenly Prisons to not only protect your trap cards, but also search any trap from the deck. And while this is currently being used to search Imperial Iron Wall and Dimensional Barrier, if the meta ever has another spell-focused deck at the top, don't be surprised if we see this card make a comeback. Anti-Spell is objectively one of the strongest cards ever put into a video game box, so I'm obligated to give it the number 2 spot on this list. However, I hope one day that this list will be a record of a once legal card, as I genuinely believe this card should be banned. I hate you, Anti-Spell, but I'm contractually obligated to place you this high on the list. If you know anything about video game promos, then it should be no surprise that coming at number 1 is Harpie's Feather Duster. Yeah, that's right, the same game, Stability Test and Duel, had two of the best promos in Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game history, on top of being a really fun game to play. And yes, Konami chose, in my opinion, the best promo ever put into a game box as their pick in the Early Days Collection as well. One of the strongest spells from the undertested thrust of the wall and see what sticks era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Card design, Duster is a great example of how to make a broken Yu-Gi-Oh! Card in the first era of the game. Keep the effects simple yet incredibly powerful, and don't give it any balancing downsides. In this case, the card's got one line of text: destroy all spells and trap cards on your opponent's side of the field. And that's it. No costs to pay, no restrictions upon the user, and unlike its still banned counterpart Heavy Storm, you don't lose any of your own back row in the process. Something used to make Heavy Storm more balanced than Harpies before Yu-Gi-Oh's Graveyard became a second hand. Now, I talked about this card at length in my ban list history video, but to sum it up, why this card is so powerful, obviously it can just end the game versus back row heavy decks, especially when it first came out, as most back row back then had no graveyard effect. Also, going second can be one of the best ways to break a board when paired with a way of dealing with monsters, like for example Raigeki. In addition to this board-breaking power, however, it also affected how older format players play in the same way as cards like Mirror Force do in GOAT. To put it simply, if you were playing a slower format like GOAT, then a fear of a wipeout by Heavy Storm or Mirror Force often made players play much more passively, usually committing a couple of resources to the board for Storm or a couple of monsters for Mirror Force, and Duster does the same thing, with the added benefit of not hitting your own back row, meaning it was easy to shotgun versus an overcommitted opponent, and easier to bluff since unlike Heavy Storm, there was never a situation where firing this card off was a bad idea. For example, if you had 3 back row, this card was still completely safe to activate, unlike Heavy Storm. Adding on to this, even versus cards that can be chained to it like burn cards or cards like Raigeki Break, this card was still good back in the day because it could force these cards to be used in inopportune times, such as just Desserts versus a small board or Raigeki Break on the wrong monster, making this card valuable even if it didn't destroy a lot of cards. This card was so powerful it was one of the first cards to be banned and remained banned for over a decade and a half. And even the points on banning, well yes, the game had evolved to a point where this card wasn't quite as broken as it used to be, it was still a side deck staple for years, being able to out Floodgates, beat decks like Trap Tricks and Labyrinth, and even today this card can out both Fiends with Equips and certain Blue Eyes boards if they can't protect True Light. However, you all likely knew that Harpie Third Sister is a very powerful card, but the reason I put this card at number 1 was, like I said, the fact it came with one of Yu-Gi-Oh's best games, giving many young players a chance for the first time to get a powerful staple without paying much money, and again that they could build almost any deck they wanted due to the password system, making Harpies, the other promos that came with it, and the game Stability Test and Duel one of the best Yu-Gi-Oh products ever made, and a great way to get kids from beginner to more intermediate to eventually advanced Yu-Gi-Oh play. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next video.